Welcome to another terrible edition of my God of War study guide. This chapter is a small masterpiece inside the big behind-the-scenes museum masterpiece. And although that sounds pretentious, it is true. Footnote 2. Still Lives. After the death of Ruby's grandmother Nell's first fiancé, she meets football player Jack Keach. Jack, her brother Albert, and their friend Frank go to fight in the trenches of World War I. Albert dies in combat, as does Jack a few months later, after which Nell marries Frank. On the way to the honeymoon, Rachel drops dead. Characterization. Jack is presented as quite aloof, thinking of the war as all a piece of nonsense. He is attracted to Lillian because of her aloof and individualistic look on life, unlike the conservative Nell. Jack and Lillian seem to agree about most things. Rachel is presented here in this traditional evil stepmother role, telling Nell to leave off that noise when she is crying for Jack's safety, and saying, "He's gone then, has he, the light of your life," when Albert leaves them for the front line, never to return. Albert has an extraordinary capacity for happiness, something which is presented throughout the chapter as an anchor for Lillian and Nell through difficult times. He collected good days the way other people collected coins or sets of postcards. Lillian is presented as an individualistic, strong-willed activist type, more intelligent and mature than Nell. Jack describes her lovely slanting eyes like a cat, and the feeling you got that secretly she was laughing at everything as if she knew what a piece of nonsense the world was. Nell is, arguably, presented as quite an unpleasant person, forgetting Percy, her dead fiancé, within a year, and thinking she felt embarrassed for him because she'd seen the look of terror in his face, and thought how awful it must be to be such a coward. When she sees a man attempting to get out of the war, she is in many ways similar to Bunty, although at this age, Bunty was more compassionate and adventurous, as seen in the chapter Business as Usual, later on. It is likely Bunty inherited these characteristics from her mother. Literary techniques! While Albert thinks that Alice will almost certainly be an angel by now, she is in fact very much alive. Also, Frank knew he was going to die if he went back to the war, is also proleptic irony, as he in fact the lone survivor of the football team. Atkinson enjoys making lists, and here she lists the ingredients of their picnic. A dozen ham sandwiches wrapped in a clean tea towel, 6 hard-boiled eggs in their shells, a big piece of Wensleydale, slab of parkin, a bag of cinder toffee, 3 apples and 3 bottles of ginger beer. Frank experiences several instances of magical realism. At first he thinks he was no longer advancing across no man's land but was walking straight through hell. Frank also sees Albert, after his death, on the lip of a crater he has fallen into. He looked perfectly like an angel, even dressed in khaki and with his blonde curls rammed under his cap. The thin line of blood and grease across the golden skin of his cheek is revealed later in the novel to be a result of his death. When Jack kills 3 German privates, he laughed and thought it wasn't a bad routine either. While maybe not strictly speaking magical realism, it's still somehow surreal and belies the psychological damage the war has done to Jack. Speaking of psychological damage, Jack personifies the dog Bruno after his traumatic experiences during the war. Jack and Bruno understood each other. They both knew they were going to die, and because of that they kept a mutual, respectful kind of distance between them. The dog reminds him of Malcolm Innswords, the old sergeant that befriended Jack. His love for his dog simplifies the extreme psychological damage that the war has taken upon the 3 men. A common post-modern technique is to use more mundane settings to symbolize important events, and here Atkinson uses the dog training ground to symbolize the injustice of war, saying, "The bold ones, the ones that would eventually go to the front, snaked out along their own version of no man's land to the dishes and wolfed the food down as quickly as possible." Frank had no more trouble with death until 1942, the fact that Atkinson tells us this being very postmodern in nature, as it has not happened yet. When Ruby tells us that Albert had an extraordinary capacity for happiness, is in fact subtly foreshadowing Pearl's death. Pearl, who Ruby describes as all light and sunshine to my dark brooding. This strong sense of happiness, much like the angelic curls, is often given to those who die early, while the ones who survive, like Bunty and Nell, irritable and selfish. When Nell is frightened that Lillian's baby will be born with thick black hair and cheekbones like razor clams, it foreshadows who the baby's real father is, Jack. Nell's proclamation that at last she was going to be the most important person in someone's life echoes Ruby's marriage to Guy and Carlo Bondetti at the end of the novel, where she tells Bunty, "I've found someone who wants me at last." Ruby, Nell, and Patricia all experience the need to be wanted by a man who will eventually disappoint them. However, while Ruby eventually feels that she has regained her identity when she is no longer the oddly named Ruby Benedetti, Nell feels that to have been Mrs. Percy Sivright would have given her a shape and identity that seemed to be denied to plain Nell Barker. Much like their desire to be wanted, Ruby and Nell are also connected by being attracted to similar physical features. Jack has high, sharp cheekbones like razor clamshells, whereas Guy and Carlo Benedetti has cheeks that are as sharp as knife blades. Albert didn't really believe in death, a concept which echoes Ruby's refusal to be emotionally affected by those around her. This unbelief in the fact of death is perhaps a coping mechanism for Albert, in the same way as Ruby blocking out the memories of her sister was for her. Here in this chapter Albert dies, as a result of possessing the angelic blonde curls that are a curse of his family. His death is foreshadowed by the line, "It was hard to see how he was going to stop looking like a boy and start looking like an old man, never mind all the years in between." This chapter links the photographs of Jean-Paul Armand in the previous footnote with the photograph of the football players. When Frank sees the photograph at the end of the chapter, he felt a shiver of ice water going down his spine, because when he looked at each member of the team, in turn, he realised that out of the whole lot, there was only one still alive, and that was him. As well as when Nell's photograph was taken with the family, which is a link to the premonition that there would never be another time. This chapter is obsessed with death, and the deaths of Albert, Jack, and Rachel are particularly symptomatic of Atkinson's fixation with death throughout the novel. The chapter includes the death of the innocent Albert with the blonde curls, as well as the death of the hated character Rachel, who the reader is encouraged to feel hatred for and to be pleased by her death. The phrase "old friend death" is used to describe Frank's particular acquaintance with the phenomenon. This chapter takes place before and during the war, and Nell's need to get married is rooted far more in the desire for security than it would be nowadays, or even in Ruby's time. The First World War takes centre stage in the story, with Albert saying it would be a bit of a lark. Because of this more patriotic, chivalrous time of the early 20th century, it would have been considered very cowardly to attempt to escape the army, and Nell's scorn of Bill Monroe, the man who doesn't want to go back to the front line, represents the attitude of the time. The wife feels that it is her identity to be a wife, and that no one can or should take this away from her. She feels that she can be nothing else in life. Nell is similar, but before she is married. Nell feels the importance of marriage in her identity and feels unfulfilled as a single woman. The statement, "Finding and keeping a husband had been a fraught business and she didn't want to have to go through this again," echoes the wife of Bath's obsession with finding marital partners. Similarly to Nell and the wife of Bath, Pip is defined by his relationship with another person, namely Estella. Unlike both of them, he never marries, is merely pained by his distant relationship with Estella. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.